Hello, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region. And this video is for January 2023's Lola's Choice pattern, Laxo Socks. If you've been following me for a while, you might know that I am not always an avid sock knitter, but I'm going to tell you that Laxo Socks might be the quickest I have ever knit a pair of light fingering weight socks before. I used the Laxo Stitch, which I used in the Laxo hat and also the Laxo cuff. And I just find that the stitch was like begging to go onto the leg of a sock because it works with elongated stitches and stitches that cross over each other like they're cabling without a cable needle. And it just makes this like squishy, scrumptious, elastic fabric. Super fun to knit. So the Laxo socks are a toe-up sock, and in this video, I'm going to go over everything that you need to know to knit these socks successfully. I am going to assume that you already own the pattern for knitting these socks. If you're a member of Lola's Choice for January of 2023, then you got a pattern with your kit, but the pattern is also available for purchase on Ravelry and my website. So in this video, I'm going to go over the architecture of the sock so you understand each element that goes into knitting a toe-up sock. I'm going to talk about choosing a size so that you end up with a sock that fits you or fits whoever you're knitting it for. I'll talk a bit about gauge, and then I'll show you how to do the cast on, how to work the gusset increases, and everything else that you need to know. So let's jump right in for the first thing, which is the architecture of this sock that I am still holding in my hands. Okay, let's look at this sock and let's also talk about the yarn that I used. The yarn that I used is a cone of yarn from Land du Nord, and it's called Watercolor Sock. This yarn is dyed, I believe it's print dyed, to make two identical pairs of socks. So on this cone, the first half of the cone is for one sock, and the second half of the cone is for a second sock. So if you are a knitter who likes to knit two at a time socks, you're probably going to want to wind off the first sock's worth of yarn. You'll know when you've made it through the first sock's worth because there will be a little like white undyed area of yarn so that you'll be able to start from the yellow at both points. I really loved starting with the yellow for the toe and then ending up with these kind of like purples and blues up at the cuff. You can certainly wind off your cone and work in the other direction. This yarn has about 458 yards to 100 grams. So if you are knitting with another sock yarn, just find one of a similar weight. So that's what you need to know about this really fun yarn. If you're knitting it singly, you can knit it right off the cone. I meant to say that as well. I knit mine one at a time. I'm not a two at a time sock knitter myself. I like knitting on double points more. So if we talk about the architecture of this sock, you'll be starting with the toe, and we'll be starting with Judy's Magic cast on at the toe, and I'll show you how to do that. You then increase stitches for the toe until you get up to the stitch count for the size that you're making. You'll then be working in the round for the foot without any increases. And you'll be working that until you get up to the length that is appropriate for the length of your foot. We are going to talk about that when we talk about sizing. Then you'll start increasing for the gusset. And if I just move this sock over underneath the overhead camera, you can see the increase line right there for the sock. So your sock right here is one circumference, and then as you start to do the increasing, you have more and more stitches on your needles. You end up with something that kind of ends up, just to not make things too crazy, but you end up with something that looks much wider than it looked when you started knitting it. Let's move that yarn back over there. After you have worked the gusset and you get up to the stitch count for your gusset, that gusset basically goes from here all the way down to the bottom of your foot. You'll then work this fun little heel turn with German short rows. Again, I will totally show you how to do that. This heel turn is very important because our feet are not shaped like at 90-degree angles, right? We have that little bit of a cup at the bottom of our foot for our heel, and we need to turn the fabric so that it can turn and kind of cup our heel so that it fits well. After you work that heel turn, you then work a heel flap going up. And this heel flap is worked back and forth flat, decreasing down your gusset stitches on each side of your sock as it is worked up. For those of you that have knit any of my side-to-side Nova sweaters or any of my modular shawl constructions, this is the exact same technique that I use in all of those designs. So if you're familiar with those, this probably isn't going to rock your world that much. After you work this heel flap going up, you then join back into the round and work the leg. The leg has the same stitch count as the foot for the size you're making, and you can make that leg basically as long as you want, as long as you aren't running out of yarn. You can keep going. You could make almost like knee highs with this yarn if you're making one of the smaller sizes, as long as you leave yourself enough yarn for doing the 2x2 ribbing at the top and the bind off. So that is the architecture of your toe up sock. I hope that makes sense. Certainly ask any questions if you have any. Now, one thing we need to talk about before you can cast on is gauge. Oh, and size. So let's talk about that next. Whoops, I got so excited about gauge, I forgot that the next thing we should talk about is choosing a size before we talk about gauge. So if you look down here, you will see the portion of the pattern that shows you all the information about the sizes and finished measurements. And I just want to go over this with you together because there's really nothing worse than a sock that doesn't fit. I love hand knit socks when they are tight and fit well around my foot, but when they're baggy and loose and fall down, it's really frustrating. And the decisions that you'll make when you're choosing a size are going to make sure that your sock fits well. So you'll see that I've given you 5 different sizes, 1 through 5. And once we decide what your foot circumference is, that will dictate which size you are making in the pattern. So what you want to do is take your foot and measure your foot around the ball of your foot. So underneath where your toes are, right about like right here on your foot, go ahead and measure around. And then you're going to want to choose a size that is 1 inch smaller than your actual foot measurement so that the sock is stretching around your foot. So my foot is about 8 inches around, so I chose to make the 7-inch circumference sock, which is the size 2 sock. The biggest mistake you could make is to measure your foot and choose the exact same measurement as your foot. So I'm 8 inches around. I chose the 7-inch, which is the size 2. And then for foot length, the foot length is totally adjustable to the length of your foot. And you want your foot length to be about a 1/2 inch smaller than your actual foot length. So if I'm going to tell you that my foot is 9.5 inches from the back of the heel to my toe, I know I'm going to want to have a foot length, a finished foot length of 9 inches. So if you want to, when you're doing this, go ahead and write down your actual measurements on here and then do the math where you're subtracting 1 inch to get your foot circumference, and then do the math where you're subtracting a 1/2 inch for your desired finished foot length. Those are going to be the things that you'll do so that you have success and end up with a sock that fits you. If you are knitting your sock for someone else and you don't know what size their feet are, Kate Atherley has an excellent book on designing socks that has charts for like every size foot imaginable. So I highly suggest that book if you want to have kind of a resource on hand for being able to look up different average foot sizes. Okay, So now that we've talked about size, we can talk about gauge. Gauge, kind of important, right? So if you don't get gauge with your yarn, you're gonna end up with a sock that doesn't fit. You'll see that the gauge that I call for in this pattern is 36 stitches by 44 rounds. That is 9 stitches and 11 rounds per inch. This is a really lovely, dense sock fabric that is really, it's got really high abrasion resistance because I knit it so tight. And I think that that's really important to end up with a sock that fits in your shoe well and is comfortable and lasts without stretching out. So your goal is 9 stitches and 11 rounds over 1 inch. I would say stitch gauge matters more than row gauge in this case. But what is really fun about a toe up sock is that you can actually cast on for the toe and knit 2 inches and then put your knitting on some scrap yarn and block it and let it dry all the way and measure it. And if you have gauge, then you can just put those stitches back on the needle and keep knitting. If you don't have gauge, then you'll have to rip that out. You might want to steam the kink out of your yarn and then start again. The other thing that you can do if you know that you're starting your toe with the yellow on the cone is you can wind off the cone and start from the other end and do a gauge swatch with the other end of the yarn that you're not going to start knitting with, so that you have a little bit of yarn to play with as you're doing those gauge swatches. So you kind of have 2 choices for working gauge. I know for me, I am a loose knitter, so I knit my Laxo socks on a size 0 needle. Most of my model knitters or test knitters knit with a size 1 needle, so that's a 2.25 millimeter needle. When you get your gauge, when you go to measurement, if you have too few stitches per inch, like let's say you have 8 stitches per inch instead of 9 stitches per inch, that means your gauge is too loose. You're going to need to go down in needle size to tighten things up. If you have like 10 stitches per inch and your fabric is like bulletproof, then you're going to need to go up a needle size because your fabric is too tight. I thought it would be fun to show you. I'm actually knitting another pair of Laxo socks for my father-in-law. I bet that these will be done in February for his birthday. And what I'm doing right now is I'm working with a yarn that's a tiny bit heavier than what you guys got for Lola's choice. So I am knitting the toe as my gauge swatch. And when I get a few more inches on this toe, I'll stop and block it and see if I have that 9 stitches per inch and then go from there. So I thought that was a good example to show you like how you would apply this to other yarns or doing gauge in the wild, right? Okay, so that is gauge. We've talked about size. We get to start knitting by casting on for the toe and doing Judy's Magic Cast On. All right, I'm going to show you how to do the cast on and work the toe for Laxo socks. I like to work my socks on double pointed needles. I know many people like to knit socks on a magic loop, which is 1 long circular needle, or even on 2 circular needles. That is completely up to you, but for this video, I'll be showing you how to knit the socks on double pointed needles. So I've got 2 needles right now for working the cast on, and I'm holding them parallel to each other. And then I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to put it over the back needle with the tail held to the back of the needle and the working yarn held to the front of the needle. Now I am so comfortable doing Judy's Magic Cast On that sometimes it's hard for me to slow it down and really show it to you, but I'm going to do my best to do that. So tail to the back, working yarn to the front. Now I'm going to take that tail and bring it to the front, and I'm going to take the working yarn to the back. And what that is doing is creating like a little cross between those 2 yarns underneath that back needle. Now, the yarn that is held off my index finger is going to go over the front needle, and the yarn that is held over my thumb is going to go over the back needle. So since I already have a stitch on the back needle, I'm going to start with my index finger. I'm going to bring that yarn in front of the front needle and then slip the yarn in between those 2 stitches. And now I'm going to take the yarn on my back needle, on my thumb, bring it in between those 2 needles and around the back. And now I'm going to take the index finger, come in front and go in between, and now the thumb, go in between and back. Index finger front and over, thumb in between and back. Index finger front and in between. So now I've got 4 stitches on the front needle and 4 stitches on the back needle. You probably want to circle on your pattern which size you're making. Let's say that I am making the smallest size, so I'm going to get 8 stitches on each of my 2 needles right now. See, 2, 4, 6, 7, 2, 4, 6, 7, and 1 more on each needle. There you go. Now, when you have your stitch count on both your needles, you want to twist your yarns 1 more time. And then if you're working on double pointed needles, you're going to be knitting across this top needle, but what you want to do is kind of rotate that bottom needle just a little bit so that when you go to work with the new needle, you can get your needle into those stitches. If you have them kind of sitting right like that, it can be really hard to get that needle in there. So you can see I'm kind of rotating a little bit and holding it so I can get the needle in there. And now what I'm going to do is knit the stitches on both of those needles. Once I make it around 1 round, I'm going to end up placing a marker so that I know where the right side of where the end of the round is. Sometimes I place a marker for knowing where the right side and wrong side is, but in this case, it's to know the end of the round. This can be a little tricksy. You can see that stitch just fell off, so I'm moving it. I think this first round is the hardest, and then things get much easier from here. So don't be surprised if you have to do it once or twice because things are tight. Okay, there is the first 8 stitches, and now I'm going to do the next 8 stitches. I'm going to come into that stitch. This is much easier. I'm not sweating anymore. Okay, when you get to the end here, place a marker, just a removable marker, so that you remember where the end of the round is. And I have one right here ready to go. Put that right there. Look at that cute little toe right there. What this is going to end up looking like when you're done with it is a toe just like that. You can see I've cast on right here and I'm working increases. So I'm going to knit 1 more round, which means 16 stitches total, 8 on the top and 8 on the bottom. And then I'm going to show you how to work those increases for the toe. And then we'll be able to jump on and talk about the foot and the gusset. Okay, now that I've worked those 2 rounds, on round 3, when I go to start the increases, I'm going to introduce a 3rd needle so that it's a little easier to start working in the round. So I'm starting round 3, and this is where the increases start for the toe, and I am going to knit 1, and then I'm going to make 1 right. So I'm going to lift up the bar right there in between the stitches, put it onto the needle, and then knit that bar through the front right there. And that is a make 1 right. And now I am going to knit 3 more stitches, which is half the stitches on that first needle. And I'm going to go and grab a 2nd needle, and I am going to knit 3 more stitches so that I'm going to 1 stitch before the end of the needle. Sorry, trying to keep us all neat. And now I'm going to make 1 left. And then I'm going to knit 1. And now I've done increases on the front of on the top of the foot, and I'm going to do increases on the bottom of the foot. So I'm going to knit one. And now I am going to make one right. And I learned this really fun trick from Stephen West a bunch of years ago. And the way that he remembers make one right and make one left is make one right is I'll be right back, which means you want to go into this leg right here from the back to the front to lift up that leg and then work through the front of it. And that makes a right leaning increase. And now I am going to work to one stitch before the end of the needle. And I'm going to do a make one left, which is I left the front door open. And so front, I'll go in from the front to the back right there. And that way maybe you won't have to look at your abbreviations as much when you're working a make one right and make one left. Thanks, Stephen. There you go. So that was an increase round. And if we look at this on the needles, you can see we're just starting to make a little toe right here. These stitches right here are the top of the foot, and these stitches right here are the sole of the foot. So you'll just be continuing around until you get to the correct number of stitches for your foot size. All right, after you work the toe, you're just gonna continue to work around to work the leg. You'll see for every size that there are ribbing stripes that end up undulating into the body of, or sorry, the leg, not the body, into the leg of the sock. And those are worked on the top of the foot, but not on the sole. The sole is just worked in stockinette stitch. So you're going to work the foot until your sock measures 4.5, 4.75, 5, or 5.25 inches short of the desired finished foot length. So do you remember on page 1 where you wrote down your desired finished foot length? Like I know that my desired finished foot length is a 9, and if this says that I want to work until my sock measures 4.75 inches short of that, I'm going to subtract 9 from 4.75, and now I need to do math just like this. So that's 4.25 inches, I believe. Yes, 4.25 inches. So once I measure 4.25 inches from my toe, that is when I'm going to start my gusset. Definitely let me know if you have any questions when you get to that step. So I have a little toe and tiny foot on my needles ready to start the gusset pattern, just so you can see how to work that. Let me jump ahead in the pattern so I have it in front of me and I don't make any mistakes. So I'm on round 1 of the gusset, and you'll see that the first thing that it says is make one left, which we know I left the front door open. So I'm gonna pick up that bar right here from the front to the back and put that onto the needle. And then I'm going to knit into the back of that right there. And I have increased 1 stitch. And now I'm going to take a marker and I am going to place it right there because my gusset stitches are going to be to the right of the marker right here. And now I'm going to work in pattern across the top of the foot. And then when I come to the end of the top of the foot, or the instep, I am going to place a marker right here, and now I am going to make one right. So I'm going to go grab that stitch and make one right. And I've started the gusset on the right and left side of the top of my foot, and then I am just going to knit to the end of the round. So remember I said you're just knitting your sole stitches. So basically needle 1 has half your instep, needle 2 has the second half of your instep, and needle 3 has your sole stitches. Now round 2, you're just gonna work in pattern around. And I'm going to do that quickly. Okay, so now I'm at round 3. And what you're going to do for round 3 is knit to the marker. Right now that's only 1 stitch, but as your gusset grows, it's going to be more. And then you're going to make 1 left. So your increases are always happening right next to your marker. And now you're going to work across the top of the foot. And then you're going to slip the marker and you are going to make 1 right. And then knit that last stitch and then knit across the sole stitches. And that is how you work the gusset. You're gonna repeat rounds 3 and 4 until you have the correct number of stitches on your needles and your sock looks quite wide. So I have one right here getting ready to work the heel turn, and you can see that all of my gusset stitches are on half of the top of the sock, and then the second half of the gusset stitches are right there, and you can see that increase line. So you've ended up with a sock that is much, much wider than what you started with when you were working the foot. So let's go ahead and talk about that heel turn together next. Okay, friends, so we've worked our gusset and it's time to turn this little heel right here so we have a cup for our heel to fit into the bottom of our sock. I have a step out here, a little adorable mini sock on some double pointed needles, and my gusset is worked, and I am ready to work the heel flap, or sorry, I'm ready to turn the heel. And what I have already worked is round 1, which has you working all the way around in pattern and then turning your work at the end of the round. So the heel flap is worked across the sole stitches. So that's the needle that does not have any stitch markers on it. It is the bottom of your foot. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to slip a stitch purlwise, and I'm gonna bring the yarn up and over the needle, and then I am going to purl to the end of this needle and turn my work. So I'm just purling across. The pattern has the stitch count for the size that you are making. I am making an imaginary made up size right now. When you get to the end of that row, you are going to turn your work again. And now you are going to slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front. So I'm going to bring the yarn to the front of my work, slip that stitch, bring my yarn up and over my needle, creating a double stitch. And then I am going to knit across to the double stitch I made on the last row. So the big difference right now is up until now, we have been knitting in the round, and all of a sudden we are knitting flat only on the sole stitches. So I've knit right up to that double stitch right there. I'm gonna turn my work. I'm gonna slip a stitch purlwise with yarn in front, bring my yarn up and over my needles, and I am going to purl back to the next double stitch, and I'm going to continue on like that until you have the correct number of unwrapped stitches at the center of your heel for the size that you are making. All right, I'm back with my sock again. Let's look at the heel flap. The heel flap is worked over the heel turn. It is worked back and forth. And as it is worked, it is decreasing down those gusset stitches that you made. So let me show you how to do that. I am all set up on my needles right here with that little heel turn already worked. You can actually like see the shaping of it, where it would cup the bottom of this tiny little foot. And you can see my gusset stitches on each side, and I am getting ready to decrease those down with the heel flap. So the first thing that I'm going to do is slip one purlwise with yarn in front. I'm on row 1 in the pattern if you're reading your pattern and following along. And now I'm bringing that yarn up and over the needle, making one last double stitch. And now I am going to be knitting to the end of this needle. You will be knitting the stitch count for the size that you are making. What is important is when you reach those double stitches, that wrap stitch right there, or double stitch, you're gonna work it together as one, hiding that German short row right there. So I'm gonna work until I have one last stitch. And now I'm going to treat this last stitch as one stitch, and I'm gonna work a slip, slip, knit together with one stitch from the gusset. And I find it easiest to do this, to go and get that first stitch that we're slip, slip knitting from the gusset stitches and put it onto that needle so that they are both there together, easy to work. I'm gonna slip one stitch knitwise, I'm gonna slip the next stitch knitwise, I'm gonna put that needle into the front of those two stitches, and I am going to work them together. But I just undid that because I saw that I split a stitch when I did that. So I'm going back in again, bringing the yarn through and pulling it out. It's always worth, if you split a stitch, to go back and fix it, because it's gonna end up bugging you later. You know that it will. Now I have finished row 1. I have decreased one gusset stitch. I am going to turn, so I am on row 2. I'm gonna slip one purlwise with yarn in front. I am not doing that German short row and bringing the yarn up over the needle anymore. And now I am going to purl to the last stitch on the needle. You are going to be looking at the stitch count in your pattern for the size you're making. I almost feel like I might be getting a little redundant by now. As you purl across, when you hit those double stitches, you're gonna work them together as one, and that will hide that little German short row. And now I am at the last stitch, and I'm going to be purling two together, this short row stitch with one stitch from the gusset. And again, the easiest way to do that is to leave that short row stitch on the needle, go down, grab one more stitch so that you've got 2 stitches right there, and then go ahead and purl 2 together. There we go. So we have decreased one stitch from each gusset. Now we're going to continue on with rows 3 and 4. I want to do rows 3 and 4 once with you so you can see how we do the slip stitch at the back of the heel. That is very important because it reinforces the back of the heel, which is a spot that gets the most abrasion on your foot and is the most likely to wear out. So we do a slip stitch where we're slipping one and knitting one across, and that makes a denser fabric right there, which really helps solidify the back of your foot. So you're going to slip one purlwise with yarn and back and knit one, and you're going to do that for the number of stitches your pattern calls for. It's like I keep saying that. I must mean it. And I'm just slipping one, knitting one across. And then when I get to the last stitch, I'm going to slip, slip, knit that together with a stitch from the gusset. What you can do right here is actually just take that stitch and without twisting it, put it onto that needle. And then I'm going to slip, slip, knit. Right there. Make sure you're not splitting anything. And now I'm going to go back and grab my working needle, and I am going to slip one purlwise with yarn in front, and I am going to purl to the last stitch on this needle, and then I am going to do a purl two together with one stitch from the gusset. And then you will continue doing these 2 rows until you have eaten up all of your gusset stitches and created that adorable little heel flap. So let's do this little purl two together one more time. This time what I'm going to do is just take that stitch and put it onto that needle, so then I can go in just like this and purl two together. And now I'll turn my work and work round, sorry, not round, because we're working rows right now, row 3 again. And you can see that I'm creating a denser fabric right here for the heel flap. So when you are done working that, it will look like this. Once you are done working the gusset, you will work 2 setup rounds to get your stitch count back on track and also close up any little hole that might happen at the top of the gusset that is written in the pattern for the size that you are making. And then it will be time to start to work the Laxo stitch on the leg. And I have a little swatch here that I'm going to set up so I can show you how fun that Laxo stitch is. All right, let's do this yummy, cable-y, squishy Laxo stitch together. So I am all set up with this little teeny tiny baby sock leg on my needles. I am going to be starting with round 1. I'll be showing you how to do the elongated stitches. I'll show you how to slip them, and then I'll show you how to work the across and the open stitches so you know how to do those cables without a cable needle. So I'm going to purl the first 2 stitches. And now the next stitch is a knit 1 wrapping yarn 3 times. And that's going to elongate that stitch. And now I'm going to knit 4. And now I'm going to knit 1 and wrap the yarn 3 times. And then I'm going to purl 2. Your purl pattern might be different for the size that you're making. Okay, now I'm on round 2. Again, purling the purl stitches. And then when I come to those triple wrap stitches, I am going to slip the stitch, dropping the extra wraps, elongating that stitch. And now I'm going to knit 4. And I'm going to slip that next stitch, dropping the extra wraps. And now I am going to purl. All right, now I'm on round 3, and I'm going to work round 3 where I am knitting the knits and purling the purls and slipping the slip stitches one more time. Okay, here's the fun part. I am on round 4, and I'm going to show you how to do the across stitch. What is happening here is that these elongated stitches are going to be going across into the center. So they're basically moving this stitch is moving 2 stitches that way, and this stitch is moving 2 stitches that way. And the way that that is done is super easy. I'm going to drop this next stitch. It'll just sit there because it's elongated. I am now going to knit the next 2 stitches. I'm going to go grab that drop stitch and put it back onto the needle and then knit that stitch. And you'll see I've just basically crossed those stitches. And now I'm going to take these next 2 stitches, slide them over to the right hand needle, drop the next stitch, slide those 2 stitches back to the left hand needle, put that stitch onto the needle, and then I'm going to go ahead and knit all 3 of those stitches. So basically, working the open is the exact same thing. You're just doing the opposite maneuver for which 3 stitches are getting moved in which direction. Super easy to do. Let me know if you have any questions. I think you're going to have a great time working this stitch for the leg of a sock. It's like the perfect stitch for the leg of a sock. I can't believe I didn't think of doing it earlier. Once you are done knitting your sock, you are going, or your leg, sorry, you're going to do some ribbing in pattern for the top of the sock. And then you want to make sure that you bind off with an elastic bind off so that your bound off edge will go over your entire foot and heel. I suggest using Jeny's I can say this, Jeny's surprisingly stretchy bind off. I actually just did a knit tip video on how to do that bind off. I will link to that below. Once you have finished your sock, don't forget you need to knit a second sock because most of us have 2 feet. Second sock syndrome is a thing. I suggest doing it quickly and not leaving it for too long. Otherwise, you might never get to it. Socks are great travel companions. I am going to keep my father-in-law's sock with me this winter, so whenever I need to grab some knitting to do something, it is right there. They're really easy to pick up and put down and remember where you are in the pattern. As a reminder for these videos, we do timestamp everything below. So if you need to jump ahead to something in the video to remind yourself how to do something, you don't need to watch the whole thing to be able to find that point. Of course, I would love if you would subscribe to my channel. I forgot to tell you that you will want to block your socks when you're done knitting them. They look quite small and scrunched up until you block them. I did get these really beautiful, you can see them on the wall behind me, sock blockers. I believe I got them from Poland. I can give you a link to the Etsy shop I got them from below. They're just really beautiful, and the cutouts make it so the socks dry really, really quickly once you stretch the sock around the blocker. So I highly suggest having a pair of sock blockers on hand. You'll use them once you have them. Other things to tell you. Thank you so much. I really hope that you enjoy knitting Laxo socks. I am here if you have any questions. I hope to make you a sock knitter as I have become a sock knitter. Thank you.